Well, today we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that is history. Learning our story, not only as a nation, but also the incredible cast of characters that have created this great country. And today we're going to talk about our first Prime Minister, Sir John A Macdonald, who was born on January the 11th.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me here today to talk about Sir John A Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, a giant in our history, is Dr. Patrice Dutil. And it's wonderful to have Patrice with us. He's a professor of public administration and policy at Toronto Metropolitan University. And he joins us here today as also the author of Sir John A Macdonald at 200. Welcome, Patrice.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you, my friend. Patrice, we've had a number of conversations with, of course, a number of people, including Dr. Jerry Bowler, about the importance of history in Canada. So we thought we'd continue the theme, given your expertise on Sir John A. And I love the book, by the way, because I pretend to be a student of history, and it's amazing what we can learn about so many things about our incredible country. And what strikes me is that Sir John A was one thing that people maybe underestimate is that he was the Prime Minister for some 20 years. So his influence was massive in terms of kind of setting out the foundation and the trajectory and the course of our nation. So what made him so successful, if we had to summarize it briefly, Patrice?
He was successful because he was able to convince people around him that his vision was valid, that it was the correct vision for British North America. And he was able to convince people because he was true to his word. John A. Macdonald was not only a great politician, he was also a remarkably able administrator. We forget that. Setting up a government is very difficult. And setting up something like Canada, which was a combination of American federalism and British parliamentary structures, was new territory. And so he wasn't alone. And I always want to emphasize that Macdonald was never alone. There were people in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, Quebec, of course, Quebec, which was invaluable, Ontario, who were avid supporters of John A. and of his vision, but who also helped him work the difficulties of putting together a country like that across, again, this is 1867. It's across already time zones, although we don't know them as time zones yet. That'll come a bit later. There is very little infrastructure. There's a few harbors here and there. There's no railway connecting those four provinces. We have to remember now, it's not a question of coast to coast. We're talking 1864, the first conversations to 1867, the birth of Confederation. We're talking about four provinces: Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. PEI will come in later. British Columbia will come in later. Manitoba, of course, will be the first to join in 1870 through very difficult circumstances. But the point is, it's politics, but it's also administration. John A. Macdonald comes in, and he has already an instinct that we have to focus on structures, that we have to create institutions that will be at once robust and yet at the same time flexible, so as to accommodate. We have to accommodate Nova Scotia. Why do I say Nova Scotia? Because Nova Scotia voted against Confederation in 1867. They did not want Confederation. Nova Scotians were quite happy being part of the British Empire. They had great contacts in New England. Things were going well. They were happy that way. They voted against it. They voted against it, and they elected separatists, Joseph Howe, separatists, to the House of Commons. You think the Bloc Québécois is new? It's not new. We've had this all through our history. But John A was able to convince people, and he did it because he worked really hard. It's something that I have emphasized time and again in my works. John A. Macdonald works like a dog and
Well,
constantly.
so Sir John A was certainly a giant of a figure in Canadian history for those reasons. When you look at the chessboard, it was very complex. It was 1815, 1860. It's hard to imagine our country at that time.
Yeah.
So I want to just get into this a little bit more about Sir John A as a person. Can you tell us more, Patrice, about his story coming out of Scotland as a young lad, Presbyterian no less, as I recall? Where did this man come from?
He comes, it's important, it's very important to remember the context. Uh, he comes out of, he's born in 1815, so literally a few months before Napoleon is finally defeated at Waterloo. Things in England are not going particularly well. Things in Scotland, not very well either. He's from a Highland family, the Clan Macdonald, and like many like many Scots, the family decides to leave in 1820. So young John A follows his father and mother, comes to Ontario, settles in the Kingston area, and part of a massive wave of Scottish refugees. These are the first refugees
So
to
he was a
Canada.
refugee, no less.
Oh, I think so. And this is Ken McGugan's point. This is not mine. Ken McGugan, the writer who's written so much about the Scottish inheritance in Canada, it's a massive inheritance. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Canada, you could argue, I mean, Canada is run by Scots in those days, right through the 19th century. It's Scotland all the way. So you have to appreciate that. And I say this as a proud French Canadian. My great grandmother was Scottish, but they were very much part of that first wave. He moves to Canada. It's a fairly ordinary childhood in Kingston. Goes to school, will finish high school, so to speak, and immediately launches himself into legal studies with his uncle. And in those days, he didn't go to law school. John A. Macdonald had a hand in creating the law school at Queen's University, but and in fact would have a hand in creating post-secondary education in Canada. But
Now,
in those days, he didn't do that. Go
just
ahead.
hold on for a sec.
Yeah.
So, I do remember this. I did go to Queen's University for some of my grad studies, and so he had a real hand in the establishment of Queen's University.
Yeah.
And this is the same Queen's University, and we'll get to this later, that
Yes.
took his name off one of their grand halls. Anyways, it's just
Yeah, it's true, and where
remarkable.
most of the professors were very supportive of tearing down the John A. Macdonald statue
Yeah,
in the main city park in Kingston.
yeah,
Yeah,
just
it's
stunning.
terrible.
But regardless, is it fair to say MacDonald really didn't have a childhood, a
Well,
boyhood?
he's often said that, and but again, it's fairly typical of his day. Um, Childhood is something we invented in the late 19th century. In those days, you were fed, and people were basically waiting to put you to work.
Mm-hmm.
Kids went to work all through 19th century Canada. Uh, he suffered personal trauma. He saw his older brother being killed. Apparently, it's always been very
Mm-hmm.
um, uh, cloudy, that whole episode. A
Was
lot of
that part
people.
of his the so-called confessions near the end of his life? That
No, I'm not particularly
no.
aware of that, but it's something that he spoke about at not at moments. At moments, I don't remember when it was exactly revealed, to be honest with you, but it's always been with him, and people have pointed to that to help explain his alcoholism later
Mm.
on. Um, and maybe that has, again, maybe that had an impact. Unfortunately, he's not Mackenzie King. He did not keep a diary,
Mm-hmm.
and men in that period did not reveal that kind of stuff
Mm-hmm.
about their past. People have said that he might have suffered from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Uh, it's possible that would have had an impact, but on the other hand, it doesn't seem to have affected his evolution. He
Mm-hmm.
joins the legal world. He becomes a recognized lawyer in Kingston. Businessmen like him a lot. He's very good at corporate affairs. He's also distinguished himself in criminal law, famously defending an American who had crossed the St. Lawrence to attack Canada in the 1837 rebellion. A guy called Schultz. Macdonald defended him, but not successfully. The poor man was hanged. But he was recognized as a lawyer. By the time he's in his early 30s, is one of the
Hmm.
dominant lawyers in Kingston, and
Hmm.
that is eventually parlayed into a political career. And next thing you know, he's in politics for almost 50 years. So
It's really remarkable. So
it
his
is.
his political career was stunningly long at 50 years. And what about his family life with his marriages and really the tragedy of some of the deaths of his children?
Yes, more tragedy, more tragedy. Again, very typical of the 19th century. He marries a distant cousin. He goes back to Scotland in the 1840s. That's something about Macdonald. He went back to Scotland a lot. I mean, he's a very proud Canadian, very proud of what he is. But at the same time, he never loses his attachment to Scotland and to Britain. That'll affect our politics. It'll affect our institutions at the same time. But he goes back to Scotland. He meets this cousin. Um, she returns the visit the next year, and so he gets married in 1843, as I recall, the same year he launches his political career. And it's a happy marriage. There'll be a child born. That child, again, typical 19th century, will die. He has another boy, Hugh John, who will become eventually premier of Manitoba much later on, but and only briefly. Hugh John is a healthy boy, but it will always cause serious heartache to Macdonald. They fall out a lot
Hmm.
for reasons we could talk about maybe perhaps later. But Hugh John is more anyway. His wife um, dies 10 years later following a chronic illness. And again, Macdonald takes her to London. He takes her to New York City to try to find a solution to her ailments. It doesn't work. She dies at Christmas 1857, as I recall. And after that, he'll spend 10 years as a bachelor raising Hugh John. And again, having terrible fights with his son over all sorts of issues. When he's in London in 1867, he reconnects with um, another young lady who's much younger than he is. By that time, he's 52 years old, and she's 31 years old. That's Agnes, um, Agnes Hewitt, Agnes Bernard. I'm sorry, and she's the sister of his deputy minister of justice. But anyway, they fall in love. They get married in February of 1867, so just before Confederation. Agnes, who knows Canada, she's been in Canada. She'd known John A. Macdonald before. They get married in February 1867. Georges-Etienne Cartier is there. The whole gang, the whole Canadian gang negotiating
Hmm.
Confederation is there. And she'll move back to Canada a few months later, and she'll be the wife of the prime minister for the rest of for the rest of the century.
Hmm.
Um, they have a child, uh, Margaret Mary. A few years later, unfortunately, this baby is born with hydrocephaly. She is gravely ill. She'll never walk.
Mm.
She
Wow.
will be mentally impaired for all her life. She'll live a long life. She won't die until the 1920s, which is again remarkable for a person born with
Hmm.
that kind of condition in the late 1860s. Testimony to the great care that she was given and to the support that she was given all through her life by her father and her mother. Johnny Macdonald loved her to death. Um, it was a special moment for him to have her, and she wrote letters now and then, and it
Wow.
was very affectionate. It's all very affectionate. All this to say that John A had often a troubled personal life, but he took it in good cheer. He was an impressive man that way.
Hmm.
And of course, sometimes it took, it took its expression in, and that the stress of that kind of life took expression in his alcoholism. He did
Hmm.
drink to excess. It made his reputation, unfortunately. He drank to excess, and for a long time, for a very long time. But he sort of dried up starting in the mid 1870s. He starts to dry up uh, because he comes to Toronto, and Toronto has that effect on people. He
Is
meets a
that
lot
right?
of people in Toronto. He meets a lot of
Hmm.
people in Toronto, and he he dries up, and you won't. He'll keep drinking, but you won't hear any more stories
Hmm.
of the kind of, the kind of drunken, extended drunken periods
Hmm.
that he had in the 1850s and 1860s,
Hmm.
even into the early 70s.
Hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, he drank. He drank like everybody else
Hmm.
drank. We,
Yeah.
we had a movement in North America and Canada, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, that was a massive lobby group, probably the most important lobby group in Canada at the time, mostly led by women, but a lot of men are involved in that
Hmm.
also. I mean, you can't dismiss the men, and their task was to reduce the number of bars and to reduce the consumption of alcohol, and to force politics to achieve that objective, to
Yeah.
reduce alcohol. So, I mean, it mattered a great deal.
Hmm. So you're, obviously trained as a historian. You've
Yes.
written extensively about Sir John A. Um, it's sometimes hard to evaluate someone who has been in political life for some 50 years, who lived a long life. Would it
Yep.
be fair to say that Sir John A. Macdonald was a complex person?
Oh, sure. Of course. I think that, it goes without a doubt. Very, very complex, and his achievements were
Hmm.
complex.
Hmm.
We're all complex. You're complex. I'm complex, but we don't translate all these contradictions that we
Hmm.
have, and our manners of accommodating all
Hmm.
those contradictions
Right.
into a personal success, a political success. He managed all that. I think that's what makes him all the more interesting.
Hmm.
Um,
But clearly, this is part of the challenge of doing history: is that we're dealing with what are
oh, yeah.
called human beings. They have complexity.
Yes.
They're not two-dimensional props.
Yes.
But in this case, it's clear to say that Sir John A. Macdonald played a central role in the creation of this country. So I want to just briefly, uh, quickly highlight those accomplishments because obviously he didn't play checkers. He played three-dimensional chess.
Yes.
Because if you know anything about Sir John A. Macdonald and the
Yes.
establishment of history, the cast of characters is just stunning,
Yeah.
both domestically and internationally. So, what would you say are his key accomplishments?
Well, I without a doubt, Confederation, convincing people to support Confederation,
Hmm.
um, running that first campaign in this, August and September of 1867, and winning that campaign, legitimizing the project of creating a country. I think that's without a doubt his first monument, and
Hmm.
for that alone, I think he merits uh, every every plaudit possible. I mean, he
Okay.
deserves the praise for that.
All
But
right.
then
So
again,
I'm
go
I'm
sorry,
going to ask you then a straight up question. Then,
yeah,
would Canada exist if it weren't for a guy named Sir John A. Macdonald?
it probably would. Again, I would emphasize that John A. is um, is very much a man who works with others. He's not, he's often accused of being a dictator. He wasn't. He always worked with others.
Hmm.
But he's one of those guys. He's always a keystone. He's a keystone. He's the guy that makes the thing hang together. A
Hmm.
lot of people in Ontario wanted to see a Canada coast to coast. George Brown wanted to see a Canada coast to coast. Um, you know, Even people in the Maritimes, some people in the Maritimes wanted to see a Canada coast to coast. Why? Because it made sense. It would make sense economically if you could develop the West. It could make sense, especially in defense of the Americans.
Hmm.
If you had an ambition to keep North America British, well, you had to keep it protected from the American Republicans. Uh, that was for a lot of these people key. What makes Macdonald different is that he's able to forge those coalitions. He's able to
Mhm.
speak to let's say it, I mean, the French Canadians, the Quebecois,
Yeah.
to convince them that Canada was worth a shot, that Canada, with its federal structure, but with a strong central government, would avoid the excesses of the American republics, the secessionism of the American Republic, by giving the provinces the flexibility to organize themselves uh, in a manner that was consistent with their political culture. So
Hmm.
people like Georges-Étienne Cartier, for example, will openly defend the Confederation project by saying that we in Quebec will have control over our destiny, that we will be able to maintain our French heritage, our Catholic heritage in a Protestant country. We are joining a Protestant majority, but within that Protestant majority, we'll be able to maintain ourselves and grow within
Hmm.
this new entity. We will benefit from the defense, the joint defense of Canada. And so Macdonald nobody else could do that. George Brown could not get along with the French Canadians. He could not get
Hmm.
along with, he
Yeah.
didn't like Catholics. Uh, and Catholics, I mean, 40% of the population is Catholic in those days. So I mean, it's that ability to talk, it's that ability to get along with the Irish,
Hmm.
to respect the Irish, uh, to respect the Indigenous people, it's to respect women. I mean,
Hmm.
John A. Macdonald will reveal himself to be something of a feminist when in 1885 he proposes in the House of Commons that women be given the right to vote,
Hmm.
that Indigenous people be given the right to vote. That's
Also,
revolutionary.
also blacks.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
Anybody,
Yeah.
anybody, except, well, and if we get into another story here, which is with the exception of Chinese
Hmm.
people, because at that time in 1885, there is sorry, there's an enormous, um, there's a swelling of opinion in the West, in British Columbia in particular, but also in the United States, that the Chinese population is now a threat to the country. It's become too large, and
And that was because of the, as I recall, the civil war that was happening in China. I think there was
well,
tens
there's
of
a lot,
millions that
yeah,
died,
the
and they
Taiping. Yeah,
were,
well, yeah, yeah, it's a
yeah.
product of the Taiping Rebellion, but the fact is that the Chinese international migration is an important phenomenon.
Hmm.
We in Canada had attracted Chinese migrants in order to build the CPR.
Hmm.
It was vital. They had been vital in the American building of the transcontinental 20 years earlier. They came to Canada to do the same thing, and even though 600 Chinese workers, we estimate about 600 Chinese workers died building the
Well,
CPR, which is a dramatically, I mean, that's a high number. It's a terrible
horrible.
number. Um, Macdonald, in order to gain support for his wish to give women and Indigenous people the right to vote, had to compromise. He wasn't happy about it. He did it. He did it. He also imposed an entrance tax, what became a head tax on Chinese migrants. He didn't stop Chinese immigration. The
Hmm.
Americans had stopped it flat. We didn't stop. Johnny did not stop it, but he put an entrance tax
Hmm.
on Chinese migrants, and that of course has harmed his reputation
Yeah,
enormously.
but to be clear,
Yeah,
Canada at that time, as it was emerging as a country, was a mere 4 million people, as I recall.
yeah, even
And
less maybe.
so
Yeah,
they were very, very concerned about how do you maintain a decidedly British dual culture
yeah,
with the French.
yeah.
So it was not an easy task to maintain that. And so I think I might quibble with your point, Patrice, that I'm not sure from my own perspective, and who am I to argue with you, that Canada would exist without Sir John A. Macdonald. I don't know who else could have come forward.
I I again, we're in the land of speculation here. It would have been very difficult because I guess he had that indispensable set of skills, to borrow that expression, a particular set of skills that allowed Canada to survive those very, very difficult years.
Yeah.
Again, the challenge from Nova Scotia, the challenge from Manitoba, the challenge of building a CPR in order to keep British Columbia in Confederation. These
Because
are massive projects.
huge, because British Columbia said, we're not going to join
Yeah,
Confederation. You're not going to have that vision of a coast to coast country unless you build that CPR.
yeah,
You also had the challenge of the British Aristocrats. Uh, and the myriad of negotiations he had to pull off with that group, and he did so miraculously. Also within the background, is this not correct, of an incredible emerging power, the United States, with a standing army that could have marched into Canada within a week or two.
oh,
Is this,
easily.
am I
Yeah,
overstating this?
no, no. I mean, again, I think through his diplomacy, Macdonald was able to create a new angle in the relationship between Britain and the United States. The American Civil War in all this is critical. Uh, it's not an accident that the movement to create Canada in 1864, 65, 66, 67 takes place against the backdrop of the American Revolution, the American
Mm-hmm.
Civil War. Um, the first ideas of Confederation had been launched in 1858, but had pretty well died. It's with a civil war. And again, the situation is complex because Britain supported the Confederates. For
Mm-hmm.
some strange reason, in order to protect the cotton trade,
Yeah.
the British had supported the South. And we talk
Mm-hmm.
about being short-sighted. Uh, Canadians felt as though they had to follow the British lead. And those people who really felt British in Canada, people like Joseph Howe, people like a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
Nova Scotians,
Mm-hmm.
had a strong attachment by by some strange relationship through Britain to the South.
Mm-hmm.
Johnny's not like that. I mean, he never displayed any particular affection for the South or for its designs, not at all. But what the point is though is that after the war, Britain wants to repair its relationship with Washington, and there's a conference called in Washington in 1871 to see if things can be repaired between President Grant, Ulysses Grant, and the
Mm-hmm.
British government. And Macdonald is invited because Canada is going to be the issue. The United States says, okay, Britain, if you want to be friends, give us Canada.
Mm-hmm.
No. So, I mean, that's not going to happen. Johnny
Mm-hmm.
Macdonald comes in and, he'll participate for 2 months in 1871, a conference in Washington, and will establish Canada. Again, will defend Canada and convince the United States that this is not a passing interest, that there
Exactly.
is in Canada something that has taken root and that it is by and large acceptable to the United States. That what is going to take place in Canada is going to be a moderate experiment in governance where people are peaceful and where no harm to the US will be generated.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important part. It's part of the slow cultural awareness of a land building north of their borders that will not be trouble, as opposed to Mexico. I mean,
Exactly.
already the Americans are very, very concerned
Mm-hmm.
about what the heck is happening in Mexico, and they're very fearful
Mm-hmm.
of whatever developments
Yeah.
might emerge there that might harm them. Macdonald creates that North Atlantic triangle. He establishes Canada in the minds of Britain and of the United States
Right.
that there is a third concern here and that it has to be respected. And he
So.
will do that for the rest of his life, time and again. John A. Macdonald wants a free trade agreement. He wants free. He's a liberal, small L liberal. He wants free trade. He wants trade with the United States. The Americans shut him down. They don't want free trade. They don't like the British. They don't want free trade. And as a result, Macdonald will launch the national policy in 1878, high tariffs, protection for Canadian industry, protection for Ontario and Quebec industry, as you Westerners like to say, and and that included also, of course, redoubling efforts to build a railroad because it did not work in 1870. I mean, the first experiment of the CPR to fulfill the promise to British Columbia comes to a failure. It doesn't work. Alexander Mackenzie, the other Scotsman immigrant who comes to Canada and who becomes prime minister for a short 5 years in the 1870s, does not see much merit in the CPR. He can't afford it. He doesn't have the vision. He doesn't have
Hmm.
that ambition to build that Macdonald have. Macdonald has. Macdonald comes back in 1878, roars to power, and launches himself into the CPR, convinces American capitalists, convinces British capitalists to fund the CPR. He'll throw in his own money. I'm talking about the government of Canada money, lots of promises to the CPR in terms of land grants and stuff like that. He gets it done. He gets it done. And in 5 years' time, the CPR is completed. A
Okay,
remarkable accomplishment.
so to be clear, beyond the founding of Confederation of Canada, creating this Canada, was the accomplishment of building the Canadian Pacific Railway from coast to coast. It's hard to fathom this day, because railways were coming into their own, obviously, at that time. But it was a visionary project. If you know anything about Canada's geography, I can't imagine, as someone who likes to chop wood, I can't imagine building a railway across this country at that time. It's just hard to wrap your head around that. So was he really the primary driver behind the vision of building that railway from coast to coast?
Without a doubt. Without a doubt. Time and again, the CPR runs into trouble, technical trouble. They have grave difficulties with building and across the Rockies,
Mm-hmm.
but also through northern Ontario. Money runs out. They have to appeal to the government of Canada, and they get a hard hearing. They get a hard hearing. The cabinet is not happy with the amount of money um, that is required to build this thing, and it comes back to Macdonald, and the knocks at his door, and finally it's his decision. Yeah, and again, he convinces his cabinet that this is worth doing. At some point he gets into the weeds. To get the support of Quebec, they're going to have to put an extension to Quebec City and to put an extension through the Trois-Rivières.
Mm-hmm.
He'll endure the headaches of doing this. Just imagine the troubles that we're having today with the gas pipelines in the West. Um, with all the abilities we have today, the engineering abilities we have today, it's still heavy politics,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a politics that has made it very difficult for the Harper government, the Trudeau government, the government that will succeed the Trudeau government. These are hard things. These are hard things, and Macdonald
Mm-hmm.
managed. And again, the CPR was built within 5 years. Pretty remarkable.
It really is. So as we look at Sir John A. Macdonald, and I know that we're getting into a little bit of a funny realm here of speculation, but my thesis here, and I'm asking if whether you'd support it, is that Sir John A. Macdonald really did play three-dimensional chess. As he maneuvered his international relationships with the British, he got the financiers lined up in London to finance the transnational railway. He brought together both French and British traditions with the English. He worked collaboratively with Indigenous leaders to set up treaties before the CPR went in those lands. He threaded the needle of creating a country called the British North America. And if it wasn't for him, is it fair to say we'd all be part of the United States?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think that creating those structures that will support Canada through those hard years was essential. Creating a political system, a political culture. John A. Macdonald was very much about moderation. He always considered himself a liberal conservative. He never ran on a conservative ticket. He was a liberal conservative.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people thought he was a bit of a lefty. He wasn't, but but he was always willing to put. He was always willing to put some water in his wine to get that compromise, to get things moving. So yeah, I mean, it's as I say, he never worked alone, but he's that keystone. He's always that keystone that makes the thing hang together.
Okay. So let's talk about his relationship with Indigenous
Yep.
communities. Is there a way to summarize that up? And then I'm going to talk about a gentleman by the name of Louis Riel.
Yes. By and large, the relationship between John A. Macdonald and the Indigenous population is a positive and friendly one. It's something that's been overlooked completely. Um, yes, John A. Macdonald decided, he decided to negotiate the first treaty, the first numbered treaties with the Prairie Indigenous people in the late 1860s. And he'll sign a couple of them in the 1870s, early 1870s, but most of them will be signed by the Alexander Mackenzie government, the Liberal government, through the mid 1870s. Those things were in part imposed by precedent because Canadians had negotiated arrangements, had renegotiated reserves in Eastern Canada, in all the provinces of Eastern Canada. So we were part of that tradition. Britain insisted that Canada negotiate with the Indigenous people, about 20,000 people in Western Canada, to have the same kind of accommodation. And the Indigenous population also wanted it.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to have some guarantees. And with the years, the numbered treaties involve a give and take. There will be massive amounts of land set aside for these 20,000 people. In exchange, the government will also provide them with money. There are provisions for medicines. There are provisions for education. Again, I emphasize, most of those treaties were not signed by Macdonald, although he set the precedent in the early 1870s, and he will have to live up to them through the late 1870s when he's returned to power, in the 1880s. By and large, very friendly relationship with the Indigenous people. That has to be remembered. And he cared about him. He cared about them immensely. He wanted them involved in the mainstream. He wanted them involved in politics. I mean, of course, the Liberals are outraged by that, but he wanted that, and that's an important aspect of his legacy that
Mm-hmm.
just cannot be forgotten.
And why was the outrage by the opposition at that time?
They
To
simply did not see the Indigenous people as equals. They
mm,
did not want to see Canada's politics affected by that
mm-hmm.
presence. Um, they did not think that it was important. I mean, they
And,
were very much of the view, and this is a view that's widely shared in 19th century Canada, that the Indigenous population is in decline,
mm-hmm.
and that it has no future on its own. The only way those communities are going to survive is if they learn the ways of capitalism, of self-sufficiency, of agriculture,
Mm-hmm.
which is exactly what they did in Eastern Canada. I mean, in Quebec and Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, all those communities become farmers. They are farmers. They grow
Mm-hmm.
stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In the West, it's very difficult. You have a completely different mindset. You have a mindset that is set uh, by the hunt for the buffalo, and that transition to a sedentary life, an agricultural life, is a shock to the system.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we cannot imagine a greater shock. I mean, to live for 10,000 years by the rhythm of the buffalo,
Mm-hmm.
and to suddenly be told by government and by the realities, because the buffalo is disappearing literally
Mm-hmm.
overnight. It's been the billions, yeah, I think, well, let's say many millions of
Mm-hmm.
buffalo that had roamed the prairies have gone, have disappeared.
Yeah,
It's gone. You can't live off the buffalo anymore. You have to settle, and you have to do this now. You have to do it
exactly.
now. You can't
And
you can't do it anymore.
and so
The Americans won't
within
let you. The Americans won't let you across the border.
yeah,
That border is firmed.
that's right. And so within that tragedy of the disappearance of the bison, uh, there was great starvation. And can you tell us
Yes.
about the McDonald's role in helping Indigenous people survive that terrible time?
There was starvation. People did go hungry because there's no buffalo. Um, John A. Macdonald returns to power in 1878 and takes this very seriously. He will create a program of training for the Indigenous communities. He will send farmer instructors. He will set up model farms. He will create a program to provide rations. Again, it's important to remember the context. this is the late 1870s, the early 1880s. There is no railway. There is no
Exactly.
refrigeration.
Yeah.
There is no road. You have to go through the United States. You have to purchase food
Hmm.
stocks from the United States.
But to be clear, this was a massive
Yeah,
food
yes,
safety relief operation, one of
yes,
the largest in
absolutely.
our history that saved tens of thousands of Indigenous people.
Arguably, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is a reality, and it became the largest program for the Canadian government after transfers to the provinces and after the public works and railways. It's the third
Hmm.
largest expense.
Wow.
It's an enormous investment of government funds at a time when there are no social programs.
Hmm.
There are no social programs in Victorian Canada. It's very important to remember that. On top of that, Macdonald will provide inoculation for Indigenous people. When there's a big
And,
wave
and
of
that was
uh,
smallpox. That was
smallpox in
smallpox. Yeah.
1885, the Indigenous population will not be affected. Again, many lives were saved as a result of John A. Macdonald's interventions. He had some foresight and he cared. So the idea that Macdonald was genocidal or that he did not respect the Indigenous people or that he was racist towards them simply
Hmm.
doesn't hold water.
Well,
The facts of the case are fundamentally different.
it's frankly slanderous of our first prime minister.
Yeah.
So in this context as well, let's talk about Louis Riel. He's also a complex leader in our history, certainly one of our founding leaders, and Métis, and really quite an incredible story, whether he was a martyr or insane. So, what was the relationship between Macdonald and Louis Riel? How do you summarize that one?
Well, let's just say real tension. John A. Macdonald, Louis Riel first comes up in 1869 as a topic because he will lead the resistance in the Red River
Yeah,
settlement.
right.
Um, the CPR has been announced. The sale of Rupert lands has been announced, and Louis Riel rallies the Métis, the French-speaking, what they called mixed blood in those
Yes.
days.
Hmm.
These are the products of a community of Indigenous people and the settler whites in the West
Hmm.
who are merging, who are creating families on their own, and who are creating a new culture on their own.
The Courrier de
Uh,
Bois.
Sorry,
The Courrier de Bois.
Coureur de Bois, yes, yeah, they're very much the legacy of the Coureur de Bois. Um, so Riel leads the first rebellion in 1870. That's settled militarily, so to speak, in the sense that the government of Canada will not recognize a competing government in the West. It has to be established by the crown. It has to be established, by fiat from the government. It can't be something that just comes out of the ground. So the Manitoba Act is passed. Louis Riel will stay in Canada for a while, and eventually, he's committed to an asylum. He has a mental breakdown. He eventually finds his way in the United States, gets married there, sets himself up as a school teacher, lives modestly, but he becomes an American citizen. In fact, um, the the Métis community, which has moved from Manitoba to Saskatchewan on the Saskatchewan River, um, hails him, wants him back to lead the community again as the government of Canada surveys the land on the North Saskatchewan River, and there is a fear of um, of a misunderstanding about how those lands will be surveyed.
Hmm.
Macdonald, I'll make the case, as many others have before me, that the Macdonald government was guilty of being slow. Again, let's remember that surveying a land at that scale in the 1880s is not an easy task.
No.
It takes a lot of time to do it.
So
It
they
wasn't
they didn't
fast enough.
they didn't have GPS
No,
surveys and lasers at that time. Is that right?
exactly. It takes a lot of time, and there were disputes. I mean, the Métis wanted river lots.
Hmm.
The British, trained English Canadian surveyors wanted square blocks. there was accommodation happening, but it was too slow.
Mhm.
And the Métis community, I should say, I mean, it's not the Métis community, a small portion of the Métis community were upset by the slow evolution of
Mhm.
that surveying,
Right.
and they raised their arms. They attacked government officers, the RCMP. A few Cree Indigenous people joined them. A few, only a small few. The vast majority of Indigenous communities supported the Crown, supported the government of John A. Macdonald, and of course, an armed insurrection breaks out. People are killed. Louis Riel is brought to trial, and he is found guilty of treason. He will win appeals. He will seek appeals. He will lose all his appeals, and the decision winds up at John A. Macdonald. Will he recommend mercy? Uh, John A. Macdonald did not like Louis Riel. He regretted Louis Riel's return. He especially did not like the idea of Louis Riel um, fomenting dissent among a few Indigenous people. He feared that there would be a greater movement against the Canadian government. And again, Macdonald is always looking at the United States. He
Mhm.
sees what has happened in the United States when the American army is at war with Indigenous people, where there
Mhm.
are, you know, probably millions of people being killed. Macdonald is horrified by what the Republic has done. He doesn't want any of that, and he takes pride in being a man of peace, where he has achieved peace at minimal cost. I mean, the RCMP is very, very small. It's trivial.
And
When you
and
think of the scale of the West, it's a trivial force.
yeah, and the RCMP, to be clear, was founded why?
Well, it was created. It was called the Northwest Mounted Police. I shouldn't call it the
Mhm.
RCMP. It's the NWMP, Northwest Mounted Police, and it was created to bring peace, to arbitrate. It was not an army. It was a police force. This is fundamental. It was a police force, not an army. The Americans sent the army.
Mhm.
Johnny Macdonald sends the police. He had the ambition of creating a police force that would be inclusive of Métis people, that would have Indigenous people part of the Northwest Mounted Police. So, I mean, his view, his ambition, which I think is very much emblematic of the Canadian spirit that
Mhm.
he incarnated already. Um, what was of a view of maintaining peace, order, and good government,
Right.
something we all aspire to.
And
Now,
to be
again,
clear,
did he succeed? That's the question. I
yeah.
mean, were there flaws? Go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm
No, no.
talking too much,
I
David. Go
guess
ahead.
what I'm getting at, Patrice, is that he had with his government a very different, contrasting vision of
Oh yeah.
settling this huge continent in contrast to the United States.
Yeah.
If you look at the founding of the RCMP, it was to establish law and order as a police function, as you say, not a military function, not the army. And it was also designed to uphold the protection of the rights of all its citizens, including Indigenous Canadians.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Now, again, did he succeed? No. The reality is that there are very few Indigenous people who are willing to join the Northwest Mounted Police. There's no doubt that there was a lot of prejudice among the members of the Northwest
Mm-hmm.
Mounted Police who did
No
not want to
doubt.
have anything to do with the
Yeah.
Indigenous people. Did the farmer instructors work? A lot of them did. A lot of them did not. Was there enough money sent to famine relief? There's a lot of evidence that they did not. It's very hard to deliver foodstuffs to the West in the 1880s. It's very
Mm-hmm.
difficult, and stuff rotted. There was never enough. Um, some people died. It's undeniable. Some people died,
Yeah.
and Johnny Macdonald was criticized in his day for that.
Mm-hmm.
But those are failures of program. They're not failures of intention. They're not failures of ambition. And I
Mm-hmm.
think it's an important consideration to remember that he tried. He tried. Did he succeed across the line? No, no, I can't say that. But he tried, which is a lot more than what the liberals did in their day um, when they were in government.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, on that front, I think Macdonald deserves praise. I think Macdonald serves to us as a shining example of what government should be able to do.
As we get to the last part of our discussion here, Patrice, let's just reflect on when Macdonald kind of wrapped up his time in office. He was very, very popular. I think his last election, he got, as I recall, 48% of the popular vote, which is really quite stunning. So why was he so popular? Is there a short, brief response to that answer?
I think, well, there's a couple of reasons, and you're quite right to point that out. And I will even point out that even in Quebec, after the hanging of Louis Riel, in the election of 1887 and again in the election of 1891, facing Wilfrid Laurier, no less, all right, the
The
son of the
formidable,
land of Quebec,
the
John A.
formidable
Macdonald.
Laurier.
John A. Macdonald picked up 50% of the vote in Quebec.
Wow.
That tells you a lot about, and Quebec had no real reason to vote for John A, because Quebec at the same time is being depleted of probably, historians estimate anywhere between a quarter and a third of its population, because there's not enough jobs. The farms are hard to maintain. The land in Quebec is rocky, and meanwhile there are lots of jobs in New England, and people are moving to New England by droves, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, they're Pennsylvania. They're moving. Maine. I mean, a huge portion of my family lives in Maine. I discovered people of my family name, and they did not return. So under Macdonald, Quebec loses a massive amount of its population, and yet they vote for him. And yet, even faced with Wilfrid Laurier, they vote for Macdonald. So that is a huge testament to his popularity. Yeah, he wins. Why does he win? Because again, he's able to convince people that he's the right man for the job. He has the right vision for the country, and he works so hard to make it happen. He works like a dog to make it happen. When he dies, there is going to be an enormous procession. There will be statues erected in his honor in Montreal. This is within 3 years of his death. In Montreal, in Kingston, in Toronto, and in Hamilton. 4 important statues. There will be eventually a 5th one in Ottawa, but that'll take a long time to be put up. Those 4 were paid for by subscribers, not government money.
Wow.
When they were all unveiled, anywhere between 10 and 20,000 people attended the unveiling. Prime ministers gave speeches in honor of John A. Macdonald. People attended, people paid for it. And those statues have all come down, with the exception of the one at Queen's Park that is protected 24/7 by police. In Hamilton, in Kingston, in Montreal, all the statues have come down. These are statues that were paid for by our forefathers who attended in droves the unveiling of those monuments. Those monuments were taken down by a few dozen, what do you call them? Hooligans. And what's worse is that our governments have supported them. We got the sad news in the fall of last year, in the fall of 2023, that the Macdonald statue in Montreal would not be reestablished, and all sorts of allegations as to why, which are false, completely false, completely wrong-minded, ignoring the context and ignoring the accomplishments that we've discussed over the last hour. But it's the trend now, and John A. Macdonald, the champion of 19th century nationalism, of an idea of Canada, is no longer considered to be suitable as a role model for our society, our very perfect 21st century society.
So to be clear, why is this so-called trend happening? I say, quote, trend, because I would say that it's informed. It's not an informed opinion. It's an ignorant trend. It's not based on fact or evidence. In fact, the facts and evidence, we should, as Canadians, take heart and be proud of our first Prime Minister and his remarkable vision an achievement to give birth to this incredible country. And no, it was not perfect, but it is an incredible country. And it strikes me that now more than ever, we need to know the history of our first Prime Minister and that incredible legacy. And the question I have then is, why is this happening? Why are we not teaching history in our schools? Or do we have politicians who have no backbone, who don't know their history, and somehow do not understand that this is an attack not only on Sir John A Macdonald, but on every self-respecting Canadian?
Well, it's a combination of that. We do not study John A Macdonald. John A Macdonald is not a subject of discovery for our students. Um, you get in all the provinces in Canada, John A Macdonald, the late 19th century, is presented to students when they're 12 years old or 13 years old, and they don't understand that. I mean, try to understand, you know, the politics of the United Province of Canada in 1864. I mean, nothing is more boring.
Yeah.
His accomplishments were administrative. He did not win great wars. He did not, it's not, even though you and I can appreciate the very significant accomplishments of the man in a context that is difficult. That kind of stuff is not material for a 12-year-old, 13-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's it. That's what they get. The name Macdonald doesn't come up in political speeches. It just doesn't ever come up. So in a context like that, when somebody says John A. Macdonald was evil, well, people say, well, maybe he was. I never studied it. I don't understand it. Maybe so. If the mayor of Hamilton or if the mayor of Kingston says John A. Macdonald was evil, or the mayor of Montreal, well, who am I to say? I've never studied this. I would take time.
But this is all part of this nonsensical trend where people don't do their homework and intelligently look at the history. And I know there's always healthy debate around these things, but let's be clear. You've got places like, Queen's University changing the name of Macdonald Hall. Our first Prime Minister, who played an incredible role in the establishment of that university, let alone its law school. Shame on them. You've got the taking down of Sir John A. Macdonald statues, as you referenced. Shame on them. These officials not doing their homework. And then you have McMaster University apologizing for celebrating Sir John A. Macdonald's birthday. And they evidently don't study their history. And these are the people in charge educating our citizens. Why, as a taxpayer, would ever we fund these places is beyond me.
Well, and we have a conservative government in Ontario that allows this. This is a shocking thing.
The question is, where is Doug Ford? Where is the whole lot of them? They're all missing in action. This is reprehensible.
I think so. I think we should be, again, take things from the beginning, reintroduce John A. Macdonald to elementary school, talk about John A. Macdonald in high school when it matters, talk about the founding of Canada. In high school right now, and there are only 3 provinces that require a Canadian history credit to graduate in high school. Most of the West does not require this. We have an approach where you start Canadian history in 1911 or after the First World War. No, I mean, we should be introducing adolescents to the real history of Canada from 1867 and, encouraging them to have a reasoned discussion of the failures of the country, but also of its successes through the 19th century, through the 20th century, and through our century. We need to take this seriously, and we will not have reform of our attitude towards John A. or of Wilfrid Laurier or any prime minister or any government until we take seriously the task of teaching our adolescents. This is critical. And I think that any reform at trying to change minds, is going to fail because our population simply does not know John A. Macdonald. So we need to get things going on that front. And shows like this one are an important part of that. Hopefully people will say, hey, you know what, I didn't realize all this, and maybe I should learn more about it. And there are books on John A. Macdonald out there that you can read, including mine. But there are a lot of things out there, good and bad, reasoned, some less reasoned, but there's a lot of stuff out there on Sir John A. Macdonald. And I think as Canadians, we have a duty to inform ourselves of those things, and not just John A, but all of our history, because it is
Mhm.
being slagged, because we are presenting ourselves and presenting to our kids a version of Canadian history that is simply false. We
Well
have
said.
enormous things to be proud of as a civilization in North America, and that can only be understood in the context of history.
Well
So unless
said.
we do that, we're just going to fail.
You're right on. So, if you had to recommend how citizens could um, be part of this popular revival of history, what would you recommend we as citizens do to kind of bone up our history? I know that I've just thoroughly enjoyed as a young child reading Pierre Berton's popular
Yes.
history books and series. Thought that was very fascinating. What would you recommend, Patrice?
Well, Pierre Berton is still read, and I still treasure Pierre Berton. I think his history was accurate and fun, and lively, and inspiring. Since then, we've had other books on John A. Macdonald. Just to name a few, Jed Martin wrote a small biography, a short biography, very accessible on John A. Macdonald.
Mhm.
Richard Gwynn published a massive two-volume biography of John A. Macdonald, a lot more detailed. Again, a journalist perspective. It's very lively. It's character
Mhm.
driven. It's a lot of fun. It's very accurate. Uh, I like it a lot. I think that Richard Gwynn did a wonderful job. Jed Martin, as a professor, a little bit more serious, a little bit more attentive to context, but it's in a short book and it's very digestible and fun. I've contributed my own. You mentioned at the outset Sir John A. Macdonald at 200. It's a collection of
Excellent book.
essays from a bunch of scholars. Uh, Taking a hard look at John A. Macdonald in terms of Indigenous the population, in terms of his accomplishments, in terms of his failures,
Mhm.
his racism, all those things. Serious, attentive, scholarly presentations of Macdonald. So you have a gamut out there that is easily accessible. But you say, what can we do? Well, we can also talk to the school principals who have renamed John A. Macdonald schools in favor of nonsense, of obscure things that nobody understands.
Mhm.
How did provincial governments allow this to happen? Um, I think you should be writing letters to your MLA or to your MPP. This should not be happening. Renaming streets. I think we should be honoring John A. Macdonald with a street uh, in his honor across the country. Every town should have a Sir John A. Macdonald street. But I think we're a way off there. It's going to be a while before we can accomplish that.
Well said, Patrice. I would definitely quote vote for you when it comes to reinvigorating our history, and I think that's the point. Is that we live in an incredible country from
Yeah.
coast to coast to coast, and part of it is through our history, and we need to understand through kind of a balanced assessment the good, bad, and the ugly of our history. But nonetheless, it took incredible vision.
Yeah.
And that vision is really reflected in a stunning fashion in the personal and political history and story of Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister. And we should be proud of that. And
Well,
if we don't
David,
know our
sorry.
history, we do not know. If it's not based on facts and evidence, we don't know our history, nor do we know our identity. And if we don't know that, how do we pursue a vigorous future based on a vision for today?
I agree with you. It was Wilfrid Laurier in his eulogy to Sir John A. Macdonald who said that the history of Canada is the history of Sir John A. So if you appreciate what Canada is today, you have to appreciate what Sir John A. did for the country. And this came from a contemporary and a bitter adversary. That's something to remember.
So well said. So thank you so much, Dr.
My pleasure.
Patrice Dutil, for joining us. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.